Thank you. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, just quickly. Why is a journalist talking about obesity and diabetes and things like that? I was a hardcore science journalist. I had a science background and a journalism degree. I went to several graduate schools until my father ran out of money, and that was when I was in journalism school, so it's like musical chairs. That was it from there on in. I wrote about controversial science. I started my career working at a high-energy physics lab. I lived at a laboratory outside of Geneva for a year, and I watched some very, very smart physicists discover non-existent elementary particles. And I wrote a book about it, which turned out to be an expose since they had screwed up. And I spent the rest of my career, I was just fascinated with good science and bad science and how hard it is to do science right and how easy it is to get the wrong answer. And I wrote a book about something called cold fusion, which was one of the great scientific fiascos of the late 20th century. And after that was done, some of my friends in the physics community, I had a lot of them, said, you should get into public health writing, because if you think the science of cold fusion was bad, you should see some of the stuff that they're pushing on us from the public health community. So in the early 1990s, I started writing about public health and doing a series of investigations, sort of moving from one subject to another. You know, is salt really the cause of high blood pressure? Is fat really the cause of heart disease? And then in 2002, I ended up doing a cover story for the New York Times Magazine, which was called "What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie?" And there was a picture, it was kind of famous. There was a picture of a porterhouse steak on the cover with a pat of butter. And it was seen as a sort of apologia for the Atkins diet. Like I had brought the Atkins diet back from obscurity. And the gist of the article was maybe Dr. Atkins was right all along. And as such articles do, it got me a large book advance. Okay? $700,000 to write a book. The problem with a large book advance is you haven't written the book yet. So it turned out to pay for 4 years of my life. I was then living in Manhattan, and of course the book took 5 years. And the result was this book, Why We Get, Good Calories, Bad Calories. And it is a tome, and I think when Grant said it was exhaustive, he meant exhausting. It's a hard read. Actually, throughout while I was working on this, I would have these conversations with my publisher. I have the best publisher in the business, and my editor would say, you know, I would say, I know the book everybody wants me to write. It's this 200-page sort of intelligent man's guide to weight loss, but I can't write that book because there's this huge story out there that hasn't been told about how our government screwed up, what the real science should have been, how we've been misled, you know, a classic investigative story. And so this is kind of a revisionist history and a revisionist science of nutrition and chronic disease. And the point is, I wanted to convince the authorities, okay? Because if you go to your doctor and you decide this is what I have to do to lose weight and be healthy, and you go to your doctor and your doctor says you're killing yourself, you're most likely going to listen to your doctor. So I had to write this to the doctors, the public health authorities, the science researchers out there studying this. And I tried to make it, you know, a journalist telling a research scientist that they got it wrong. You really got to give them the facts. So I put it all in there. And what I didn't realize is that nobody has time to read a 500-page book, the gist of which is you screwed up. So that's why I wrote Why We Get Fat. Not just so that it's easier to read for the lay people, but literally so that these scientists and public health authorities might actually read it. So my fantasy is you take this book, you give it to your doctor, and your doctor says, oh God, that Taubes guy, he's such a quack. But you've said you've listened to him, and what you did worked, so he throws it in his briefcase, and a couple weeks later he's on a flight to Hawaii for some, you know, medical conference, and he reached in his bag and he's already finished his John Grisham novel, and he doesn't have anything to read, and he goes, oh God, I guess I'll pick up Taubes and convince myself he's a crack. And then basically he'll get what you get today, and maybe I'll open a few minds, and maybe in 10 years from now, when you go to the doctors, they'll actually understand what I'm going to tell you today. So let's get going. There's an obesity epidemic in the works. And by the way, these are the same slides I use when I talk in medical schools and nutrition departments. They're a little bit technical. The good news is I first put them together for a talk at the Dartmouth Medical School, and the people invited me said, you're talking to doctors, make them as dumb as possible. So they're not that hard. Anyway, the whole thing is you could see back in 1960 when they did the first N. Haynes nutrition survey. Actually, the bottom of the slide's cut off. About 13% of Americans are obese. And by today, we're up to about 34% of Americans. So the obesity rates in the past 50 years have gone up about 250%. Diabetes rates, and you don't have to look at the numbers, but basically about less than 6% of Americans were diabetic in 1980, and today it's almost 17%. So actually the number of Americans diagnosed with diabetes has tripled in just 30 years. So those are serious problems, and when we talk about, you read all about the healthcare reform and the healthcare crisis, the serious problem is that the diseases that are associated with obesity and diabetes. So as you get more fatter, as you get diabetic, there are all these diseases that you're now at increased risk of contracting. So fatty liver disease, atherosclerosis, hypertension, stroke, cancer, asthma, osteoarthritis, neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's disease. As you get fatter, as you gain weight, and as you become diabetic, your risk of Alzheimer's disease increases. So this is eventually, it's beginning to overwhelm our healthcare system. And the idea is if we could cure obesity and diabetes, if we could figure out what's really causing these things, we wouldn't, Barack Obama would stay in office for another 4 years. Not going to happen that quickly anyway, so it doesn't matter what political persuasion you are. So why do we get fat? That's what we want to know, okay? Because as we get fatter, all these diseases increase in risk. And here's the obvious answer, okay? The NIH says obesity occurs when a person consumes more calories from food than he or she burns. The U.S. Surgeon General says overweight is a result of caloric imbalance and is mediated by genetics and health. Okay, so how many people in this room believe that? Well, that's good. I gave this talk on Wednesday. I was in Boston. I was talking to the Tufts University Department of Nutrition, which is the kind of people who've been writing this stuff. And I said at the beginning of the talk, how many people believed it? And nobody raised their hand. And I said, that's great. I don't have to give my lecture. And then everybody put their hands up. It's just this, I guess people are just shy. I don't know. So here's the conventional wisdom. We take in more energy than we expend, right? Energy in is greater than energy out, and we get fatter, okay? One way to put it is we overeat. When scientists, the research community talk about this, the technical term is we're in positive energy balance, and that makes us fatter. So we take in more energy than we expend. When you read the research literature on this stuff, though, you always see it, there'll be a line like obesity is disorder of energy balance. And that means, again, if we tip, so we're taking in more calories. Here's the simplest way to put it. This is, and what we want to know, one of the things we want to do in science, we want to be able to explain observations. That's what science is about. So you see something in nature and you want to explain. And the thing we want to explain with our hypothesis is that we get fat, we just take in too much energy. And we got this obesity epidemic, right? So now we have to explain why obesity rates have been shooting up. And so the classic explanation is what Marion Nestle, an NYU nutritionist, described as just improved prosperity, okay? So the food and entertainment industries turn people with expendable income into consumers of aggressively marketed foods that are high in energy but low in nutritional value, and of cars, television sets, and computers that promote sedentary behavior. Gaining weight is good for business. That's how Marion put it. Another way to put it is we live in a toxic environment, okay? Researchers nowadays use the phrase, they'll call it an obesogenic environment. And this concept was put forth by a fellow psychologist at Yale named Kelly Brownell. And Kelly described the toxic environment as one that encourages overeating and physical inactivity, okay? Taking in too many calories, expending too few. And this is how Kelly put it. He said, cheeseburgers and french fries, drive-in windows and supersizes, soft drinks and candy, potato chips and cheese curls, once unusual, are as much our background as trees, grass, and clouds. Few children walk or bike to school. There's little physical education. Computers, video games, and televisions keep children inside and inactive. And parents are reluctant to let children roam free to play. So basically, there's just too much food available, and we just don't have enough reason to be physically active, and we're afraid to let our kids be physically active. So here's the hypothesis. Increased prosperity leads to overeating, energy in and more than energy out, and you end up with obesity and the obesity epidemic, okay? And what you want to ask just is this true? Does this make sense at all on any level? You know, we treat it today like it's dogma, like somebody, you know, it's chiseled on stone on tablets somewhere, but it's not. It's a hypothesis. And one of the things you get to do in science is ask, does a hypothesis make any sense? Does it explain the observations? So we have some less obvious observations, and this is the kind of thing I did in the 5 years I was researching good calories, bad calories. I read all the literature I could find on the subject going back to the 19th century, and I did it at a time, thanks to the internet, where all this literature can be obtained, found, tracked down. I could find the libraries that had it or the bookstores I could buy it from.